The crisp, chilled air of the exclusive Ethelgard restaurant was thick with the scent of truffle oil and quiet money. Richard Sterling, a man who built his empire on audacious risks, felt invincible tonight. Draped on his arm was Tiffany, a confection of silk and ambition, her laughter tinkling like the expensive champagne in her flute. He was a king in his castle surveying his domain. Then his gaze snagged on a table across the room, nestled in a velvet-lined alcove. A woman, her face, a serene portrait of grace, turned slightly. The soft light caught the unmistakable curve of her pregnant belly. It was his wife, Catherine, and the man she was laughing with, the man whose hand rested near hers with an easy confidence, was Dominic Thorne, a titan of industry, a shark in the world of finance, and the one man Richard truly feared. The world tilted on its axis, and the gilded evening shattered into a million razor-sharp pieces. Richard Sterling believed in the tangible. He believed in the heft of a platinum watch, the deep purr of a V12 engine, and the solid, reassuring weight of a real estate portfolio that spanned half of Manhattan. His life was a carefully constructed edifice of success, and every element had its place. His wife Catherine, with her quiet elegance and respectable lineage, was the perfect foundation. His soon-to-be-born son was the legacy, the next wing of the Sterling dynasty. And Tiffany Vance, the stunningly beautiful and endlessly adoring woman beside him, was the secret ornamental flourish, the hidden rooftop garden no one else was meant to see, proving he could have it all. Tonight they were dining at Ethelgard, a restaurant so exclusive it didn't have a sign, only a discreetly embossed crest on a heavy oak door. Reservations were a myth. One was simply invited. The air hummed with the hushed conversations of hedge fund managers and aging socialites. Waiters moved like ghosts, their service intuitive and invisible. Richard had secured the table as a display of power, a casual flex for Tiffany, whose eyes were wide with a practiced sort of awe. "Oh, Richie, it's just perfect." She breathed her fingers, tracing the rim of her crystal glass. "I feel like I'm in a movie." Richard smiled, a predator's thin, satisfied curl of the lips. "Only the best for you, darling." He found her predictable adoration comforting. It was a stark contrast to Catherine, who had lately become distant. Her conversations were about nursery colors and prenatal vitamins, her attention turned inward, towards the child growing within her. He told himself this little dalliance with Tiffany was a necessity, a pressure valve for the stresses of his world, a world Catherine no longer seemed interested in. It was a harmless distraction. He lifted his glass of Macallan 25, the amber liquid catching the light like a trapped sunset. He was about to offer a toast to their whatever this was, when his eyes drifted across the main dining floor. He had a penchant for scanning rooms, an old habit from his early days, assessing the power dynamics, noting who was dining with whom. His gaze passed over a senator, a Broadway producer, and then it stopped. Cold. In the most coveted alcove, the one reserved for the city's true royalty, sat Catherine. His Catherine. The soft glow of the table lamp cast an ethereal halo around her, illuminating the gentle swell of her pregnancy beneath a tasteful navy blue gown. She looked beautiful. More beautiful, he realized with a jolt, than he had seen her in months. She wasn't tired or preoccupied. She was radiant, her face alive with an intelligence and wit he hadn't seen directed at him in a very long time. And then he saw her companion. It wasn't one of her book club friends, or a cousin from out of town. The man sitting opposite her was Dominic Thorne. The Dominic Thorne. Founder and CEO of Thorne Capital, a private equity behemoth that devoured companies like Sterling Properties for breakfast. Thorne was a legend, a phantom of the financial world. He was older, with a mane of silver hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way Richard was. He was compelling, exuding an aura of absolute, unshakable power that Richard, for all his wealth, could only imitate. 1,000 scenarios exploded in Richard's mind, each more chaotic than the last. An affair, no, Catherine wasn't the type, and certainly not while pregnant with his child. A business meeting, why she had given up her career at the art gallery to be his wife. A chance encounter, at Ethelgard impossible. The blood drained from his face, replaced by a hot, furious flush. The audacity of it. His pregnant wife dining in the most exclusive restaurant in the city with another man. A man who could ruin him with a single phone call. He felt a primal surge of ownership and betrayal. He had placed her in their beautiful home, the gilded cage of their Fifth Avenue apartment, to be safe to be his to carry his heir. He had not placed her here, in the den of his most formidable rival. "Richie, is something wrong?" Tiffany's voice broke through the roaring in his ears. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Richard's eyes narrowed, fixing on the scene across the room. Dominic Thorne said something, and Catherine laughed. It wasn't a polite titter. It was a full, genuine laugh, a sound he hadn't heard from her in what felt like an eternity. It was a laugh that was not meant for him. "Worse?" Richard snarled, his knuckles white, as he gripped his whiskey glass. "I've seen my wife." Tiffany's head whipped around, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows shooting up. "Your wife? Here with... Is that Dominic Thorne?" She knew the name, of course. Everyone in their circle knew the name. The awe in her voice was now laced with a delicious, scandalous thrill. The confrontation was no longer a possibility, it was an inevitability. He felt the threads of his carefully controlled world beginning to fray. The perfect life he had built was suddenly shockingly under threat. But the most galling part, the part that truly ignited his fury, was the serene, unshakable calm on Catherine's face. She didn't look like a woman caught in a transgression. She looked like a queen holding court, and Richard Sterling was not in the habit of being a guest in another man's kingdom, especially when the queen was his. The life Richard and Catherine Sterling presented to the world was a masterpiece of curated perfection. Their wedding photos in Vogue had depicted a fairy tale, the handsome real estate mogul and the brilliant, beautiful art curator marrying in a sun-drenched ceremony in the Hamptons. In the beginning, it had even felt real. Catherine had been drawn to Richard's ambition, his relentless drive that seemed to bend the world to his will. He in turn had been captivated by her grace and intellect, a calming presence that soothed the sharp, jagged edges of his own personality. She was, he often said, his cultural attaché, the one who could speak of Rothko and Renaissance architecture with an easy authority that smoothed his own, rougher, more transactional nature. She had been a rising star at the prestigious Vandermeer Gallery, with a sharp eye for emerging talent and a reputation for integrity. But Richard's world demanded more and more of her. It started with requests to co-host client dinners, then to manage the redecoration of their sprawling apartment, then to oversee their philanthropic endeavors, all roles that slowly, inexorably pulled her away from her own career, until one day she realized she no longer had one. He framed it as a partnership. "You're the CEO of our life, Katie," he'd say, "so I can be the CEO of the company that funds it." And for a time she believed him. The first crack in the facade was almost invisible. A charge on a credit card statement she managed. A dinner for two at a restaurant called Per Se, on a night he was supposedly working late with his legal team. When she asked, he was smooth, dismissive. "A necessary dinner with a councilman, darling. You know how it is. Had to be off the books." she let it go. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Then came the late nights that became more frequent, the business trips over weekends that he insisted she was too tired to join, especially once she became pregnant. He bought her a new car, a beautiful diamond bracelet from Graf Gestures, so extravagant they felt less like gifts and more like payments. He was building a wall of luxury around her brick by shiny, expensive brick, hoping she wouldn't notice the prison it was becoming. The lies began to stack up, each one a thread in a tapestry of deceit. He'd come home smelling of a perfume that wasn't hers, a faint, cloyingly sweet scent, like gardenias and desperation. He started guarding his phone with a zealot's devotion, its screen always face down, its ringer always silenced. One evening while he was in the shower, the screen lit up with a notification. The name was simply T. The message last night was incredible. "Can't stop thinking about you." Catherine felt the floor drop out from beneath her. The air in their pristine, minimalist apartment suddenly felt thin, suffocating. It was a classic, sordid cliché, and it was happening to her. For a week she was paralyzed by a grief so profound it felt like a physical illness. The man she had built a life with, the father of her unborn child, was a stranger. The promises he'd made were hollow echoes in the vast emptiness of their home. But Catherine was not built for victimhood. The same sharp, analytical mind that could trace the provenance of a lost masterpiece now turned its focus to her husband's betrayal. The grief slowly hardened into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. She didn't cry. She investigated. She started a private log, documenting every discrepancy. A charge for a suite at the Pendry Hotel in West Hollywood when he was supposedly at a conference in San Diego. A receipt for 24 roses sent to a downtown address she didn't recognize. Using a shared family tablet that was still logged into his cloud account, she found what she was looking for. A hidden photo album, not deleted, but simply moved to a folder labeled Architectural Surveys. The photos were a gallery of his infidelity. Tiffany Vance posing on the balcony of the hotel suite at the Pendry, wearing nothing but one of his dress shirts. Tiffany preening in the passenger seat of his Aston Martin, a car he rarely let Catherine drive. Tiffany holding up a delicate diamond necklace to her throat, a necklace Catherine recognized from a Graf catalogue she'd seen on his desk. The picture that cut the deepest, however, was a selfie of the two of them at a polo match in Greenwich, an event he'd told Catherine was a stuffy, men-only affair. In the photo, he was beaming a wide, unguarded smile she hadn't seen in years. He looked happy. He looked free. Looking at those images, Catherine didn't feel jealousy, as much as a profound, clarifying rage. He hadn't just cheated. He had built an entire parallel life, a gaudy, cheap imitation of their own, funded by their shared resources. The woman this T-lie was a symptom. Richard was the disease. He hadn't just broken their vows, he had insulted her intelligence. She knew a confrontation would be useless. He would lie, gaslight her, call her hormonal and crazy. He would apologize with expensive gifts and false promises, and then he would simply become better at hiding his tracks. That was not an acceptable outcome. He wouldn't just be punished, he would be dismantled. The empire he loved more than anything, more than her, more than his own child, that was what she would target. Her plan began to form not in a fit of passion, but with the cold, meticulous precision of a chess grandmaster. She needed leverage, she needed power, and she knew exactly who to call. Dominic Thorne wasn't just a name she knew from the financial pages. Years ago, before Richard, he had been a major patron of the Vandermeer Gallery. He had been impressed by a monograph she had written on the works of Helen Frankenthaler, and had sought her out. They'd had several long, fascinating conversations about art investment and the intersection of the two. He had respected her mind, her ambition. He had once told her, "If you ever decide to leave the non-profit world and apply that brain of yours to making serious money, you call me first." At the time, she'd laughed it off. Now it was a lifeline. She found his private office number through an old contact. Making that call was the hardest thing she had ever done, an admission that her life was a failure. But as the phone rang, she felt a flicker of the woman she used to be, the sharp, confident professional Richard had systematically erased. When his deep, calm voice answered the phone, she didn't weep or unload her personal turmoil. She was all business. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice steady. "This is Catherine Sterling. I have a business proposal for you. It involves art significant capital and a mutual acquaintance of ours, my husband." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then a low chuckle. "Mrs. Sterling." Dominic Thorne replied, his voice laced with intrigue. "I'm listening." From Catherine's vantage point in the plush velvet alcove of Ethelgard, the restaurant was a stage, and she was its director. Every detail of this evening had been meticulously planned, a piece of performance art, designed for an audience, of one her husband. The choice of restaurant was deliberate. It was Richard's temple, a place he used to project power and seal deals. For him to see her here in his territory was the opening salvo. Her companion, Dominic Thorne, was the masterstroke. He was everything Richard aspired to be, and was not established, respected, and quietly, terrifyingly powerful. Richard's wealth was loud. Dominic's was a deep, resonant silence that commanded more respect than any boast ever could. When she had first called him, she had laid out her situation with clinical detachment, presenting the evidence of Richard's infidelity not as a wronged wife, but as a business partner, identifying a liability in a shared venture. She explained Richard's profligate spending on his mistress, the potential for scandal, and the instability it introduced into their shared financial holdings. Dominic had listened without interruption. He hadn't offered platitudes or pity for which she was grateful. He had offered something far better respect. "He's a fool, Catherine," he'd said simply. "He has a Lamborghini in the garage, and he's joyriding a cheap motorcycle. What do you want to do about it?" "I want to build something of my own," she had replied, her voice gaining strength. "I want to start an art advisory firm catering to a new generation of wealth. Tech billionaires, hedge fund managers. They have the money but not the knowledge or the access. I have both. I have a business plan. What I don't have is the startup capital, without tipping him off by moving our assets." Dominic had agreed to meet, and then to invest. He saw it not as a favor, but as a shrewd business opportunity. He recognized the untapped potential in her, the talent Richard had foolishly tried to suppress. "Revenge is a powerful motivator, Catherine," he'd advised her during one of their planning meetings. "But let's make sure the primary goal is success. The finest revenge isn't ruining him. It's making his life look small in comparison to yours." So tonight was not a date. It was a business dinner, the official kickoff of their new venture. The contract for Thorne Capital's seed investment in Sterling Thorne Art Advisory was resting in her handbag. The name was a final ironic twist of the knife she had planned for Richard. As she and Dominic discussed potential acquisitions and client targets, she felt a thrill of intellectual excitement she hadn't experienced in years. She was alive again, her mind firing on all cylinders. Dominic treated her as an equal, challenging her assumptions and listening intently to her analysis. In his company, she wasn't just Richard Sterling's pregnant wife. She was Catherine, a formidable expert in her field. She had known Richard and Tiffany would be here. She had arranged it. A week ago, she'd used Richard's credit card, the one he thought she didn't know, about the one he used for his trysts to book a spa day for a friend. The confirmation email sent to an account she controlled came with a promotional offer, a priority reservation at Ethelgard. Knowing Richard's ego and his desire to impress his new plaything, Catherine knew he wouldn't be able to resist. She had forwarded the offer to a dummy email address, and then, feigning a tech-illiterate moment, asked Richard to help her with a spam email on her laptop, ensuring he saw the Ethelgard offer in her inbox. As predicted, he had taken the bait. He likely used the same offer to book his own table, feeling smug and clever. Now, as she laughed at a dry joke Dominic made about a particularly vulgar piece of modern art, she felt a subtle shift in the restaurant's atmosphere. A ripple of tension. She didn't need to look. She could feel Richard's gaze on her, hot and heavy with disbelief and fury. She let him watch. She let him stew in the poison of his own assumptions. "It appears your husband has arrived," Dominic murmured, not even glancing in Richard's direction. He was observing Richard's reflection in the polished silver ice bucket on their table. "And he does not look pleased. His pleasure is no longer my concern," Catherine said, her voice as cool and smooth as the water in her glass. She took a deliberate, slow sip, her eyes meeting Dominic's over the rim. "Let him watch. It's important he understands that the rules of the game have changed." "This is a dangerous game, Catherine," Dominic cautioned, his tone serious. "Men like Richard, when cornered, don't become reasonable. They become reckless." "I know," she replied. "I'm counting on it. His recklessness will be his undoing. I, on the other hand, have a plan." She could see him out of the corner of her eye now, a thunderous look on his face as he conferred with the blonde at his side. He was stewing his ego, warring with the potential embarrassment of a public scene. She knew which would win. His ego always won. She gave Dominic a small, knowing smile. "Shall we order the Dover sole? I hear it's excellent. And I'd like to be enjoying my main course when he finally works up the courage to come over here." Her calmness was her armor. Her pregnancy, which Richard saw as a vulnerability, a chain that bound her to him, was her strength. She was fighting for more than just herself now. She was fighting for the future of her child, a future she was determined would not be shaped by a weak and deceitful man. The thread of Richard's lies had been unraveling for months. Tonight she was going to pull it, and his entire world would come undone. The 10 minutes it took for Richard to cross the restaurant felt like an hour. Catherine watched his approach, not with apprehension, but with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a predictable chemical reaction. She saw the internal battle in his rigid posture, the desire to maintain his public image, clashing with the primal rage of a man whose authority had been challenged, rage as she knew was winning. Tiffany trailed a step behind him, her face a mask of anxious excitement. She looked like a tourist at the scene of an accident, horrified but unable to look away. She was out of her depth, a bit player who had wandered into the climax of a drama far more complex than she had imagined. Richard stopped at their table, planting his hands firmly on its edge and leaning forward, an overt act of intimidation. He ignored Dominic completely, his furious gaze locked on Catherine. "What is this, Catherine?" he demanded, his voice a low growl meant only for them, though heads were already starting to turn. "What in the hell are you doing here?" Catherine calmly placed her fork down beside her plate of seared scallops. She looked up at him, her expression not of a frightened wife, but of a disappointed CEO addressing a failing subordinate. "I'm having dinner, Richard. It's a common activity. You should try it sometime, preferably with your own wife." The barb hit its mark. A muscle twitched in his jaw. "Don't play games with me. You're here with him." He finally jerked his head towards Dominic, the name a curse on his lips. Dominic Thorne didn't flinch. He slowly dabbed his mouth with a linen napkin, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He looked at Richard as if he were a mildly interesting but ultimately insignificant insect. "Richard, Dominic," said his voice quiet, yet carrying an immense weight that cut through Richard's anger. "You're making a scene. You stay out of this, Thorne," Richard snapped, pointing a finger. "This is a private family matter." It was then that Catherine decided to detonate the first bomb. "Is it because I wasn't aware that Tiffany was part of our family?" she said, her eyes shifting to the younger woman for the first time. She gave her a cool, pitying smile. "The necklace is lovely, by the way. Graph, isn't it, from the spring collection? Richard has such predictable taste." Tiffany went pale, her hand instinctively flying to the delicate diamond pendant at her throat, the one from the photos. Richard looked as though he'd been slapped. "How did you—" he started stammering. "How did I know?" Catherine finished for him, her voice dropping to an icy whisper. "Oh, Richard, you've become so careless. The suite at the Pendry on March 12th. The polo match in Greenwich you insisted was men only. The endless charges at florists I've never received flowers from. You built a whole world of lies, but you built it on a foundation of our shared accounts. You're not a master spy, Richard. You're just a common cheat who happens to have a high credit limit." Each word was a precision strike, delivered without hysteria. She was laying out facts, not accusations. Richard's face cycled through a series of emotions, shock, denial, and finally cornered fury. "You went through my things," he hissed, his voice venomous. "You're spying on me after everything I've given you." "What you've given me?" Catherine let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You've given me a life on hold. You've given me sleepless nights. You've given me a front-row seat to your spectacular betrayal while I carry your child. Don't you dare speak to me about what you've given me." Richard, stripped of his lies, resorted to his basest instinct, misogyny. "You're being hormonal, Catherine. The pregnancy is making you paranoid. Why don't you go home and rest? We can talk about this when you're thinking clearly." He reached for her arm, a gesture of condescending ownership. Before he could touch her, Dominic Thorne moved. He didn't stand up. He didn't raise his voice. He simply placed his hand flat on the table, a gesture that somehow seemed to suck all the air out of the immediate vicinity. "Richard," he said, and this time his voice was different. The politeness was gone, replaced by the chillingly calm tone of a man who could bankrupt countries. "Catherine is not going anywhere, and I would strongly advise you to remove your hands from my table." The shift in power was palpable. Richard's hand froze mid-air. He was a wealthy man, but Dominic Thorne operated on a different plane of existence. Dominic continued, his eyes fixed on Richard. "I heard you lost the Hudson Yards bid last week. A pity. My sources tell me your financing was shaky, over-leveraged. It's a shame what can happen to a man's reputation and his credit lines when word gets out that his personal life is as unstable as his portfolio." It was a direct threat, wrapped in the language of a business observation. It was Dominic showing Richard that he didn't just know about the affair. He knew about the cracks in Richard's financial empire. He knew where he was vulnerable. Richard recoiled as if he'd touched a hot stove. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a dawning, sickening horror. This wasn't a domestic squabble. This was an execution. He had walked into a trap, and the man holding the shotgun wasn't his wife, but the most dangerous predator in the corporate jungle. Catherine delivered the final devastating blow. "I'm not coming home, Richard. Not tonight, not ever. My lawyer, Ms. Evelyn Reed, will be contacting yours in the morning with the preliminary divorce filings. I believe she's already had a forensic accounting team looking into Sterling properties for the last 6 weeks. You might want to have your CFO prepare for that." Richard stared at her, his mouth agape. 6 weeks. She had been planning this for 6 weeks. While he was sneaking around with Tiffany, Catherine had been assembling an army. He looked from Catherine's cold, resolute face to Dominic Thorne's impassive, powerful one. He looked at Tiffany, who was now staring at him with a mixture of fear and contempt, the fantasy of her millionaire prince dissolving before her eyes. The entire restaurant was watching their whispers, a rising chorus of his public humiliation. He had walked in as a king. He was now just a fool in a well-tailored suit. "You'll regret this." He managed to choke out the words, tasting like ash. "No, Richard," Catherine said, picking up her fork again, as if he were already gone. "I'm just getting started." Defeated and exposed, Richard stumbled away from the table, dragging Tiffany with him like a piece of luggage. The short walk back to their own table was a gauntlet of whispers and averted eyes. He felt the weight of 100 gazes, each one a pinprick to his deflated ego. The hushed sanctuary of Ethelgard had transformed into a courtroom, and he had been judged and found wanting. Once back at their table, the silence was thick and suffocating. The perfectly seared foie gras and the bottle of Chateau Margaux sat untouched monuments to a ruined evening. Richard slumped into his chair, his face ashen. He wasn't thinking about Catherine or Dominic. He was thinking about the words forensic accounting and unstable portfolio. He was thinking about the Hudson Yards deal, a catastrophic loss he had managed to keep out of the press. How did Thorne know the tendrils of panic began to tighten around his chest? Tiffany, however, was processing a different kind of devastation. Her fairy tale had just been violently rewritten into a cautionary tale. The powerful, in-control man who had swept her off her feet was, it turned out, a bumbling amateur of infidelity, easily outmaneuvered by his pregnant wife. The illusion of his omnipotence shattered, and in its place she saw a weak, pathetic man lashing out. "So that's it," she finally said, her voice sharp, stripped of its usual breathy adoration. "All this time you told me she was fragile, that you were staying with her through the pregnancy out of pity." "Be quiet, Tiffany," Richard muttered, scrubbing his hands over his face. "No, I won't be quiet," she shot back, her voice rising. "You used me. You made me believe I was going to be the next Mrs. Sterling. But you were just playing house while she was planning a war." The realization dawned on her with humiliating clarity. She wasn't the cherished secret. She was the sideshow, the convenient distraction. Catherine wasn't the obstacle. She was the main event. "Did you hear what he said?" Richard hissed, his eyes darting around nervously. "Thorne knows about my finances. She's been feeding him information. She's trying to ruin me." The paranoia was taking root now. It wasn't just a divorce. It was a corporate espionage plot. Tiffany stared at him, and for the first time she felt not desire or awe, but contempt. It was all about him, his company, his reputation. She was just collateral damage. The diamond necklace suddenly felt heavy and cheap around her neck, a brand marking her as a fool. "She's not just trying to ruin you, Richard," Tiffany said with a cold laugh. "I think she already has. You look pathetic." Without another word, she stood up, her lithe frame rigid with anger. She unclasped the graph necklace and let it drop onto the table, where it clattered softly against the fine china. "I'm done being your distraction. Find someone else to finance your midlife crisis." She turned and walked away, her head held high, leaving Richard alone at a table for two, surrounded by the wreckage of his 2 lives. Across the room, Catherine and Dominic finished their meal in serene quiet. Catherine felt no triumph, no glee. She felt a profound and somber sense of release as if a great weight had been lifted from her soul. The public detonation had been a necessary ugly step, but it was over. Now the real work could begin. When the check came, Dominic placed his black credit card on the tray. "Allow me," he said. "A toast to our new venture." "To new ventures," Catherine agreed, raising her water glass. As they stood to leave, they walked past Richard's table. He was still sitting there, staring blankly at the necklace glittering next to his untouched plate. He looked up as they passed his eyes, pleading lost. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Catherine met his gaze for a moment, her expression unreadable. There was no hatred in her eyes, no anger. There was nothing. He had become irrelevant to her, a ghost from a past life. She then turned and walked out of the restaurant, stepping out into the cool night air, leaving Richard Sterling alone in the ruins of the gilded cage he had so carefully constructed. The illusion wasn't just shattered, it had been systematically ground into dust. The day after the confrontation at Ethelgard, the city felt different. The grey Manhattan sky, which had once seemed oppressive to Catherine, now held the promise of a clean slate. She wasn't hiding in the cavernous Fifth Avenue apartment, waiting for Richard's inevitable pathetic apologies. Instead, she was in a sleek, glass-walled conference room in Midtown, seated opposite Miss Evelyn Reed. Evelyn was a divorce attorney spoken of in hushed, reverent tones in the city's most exclusive circles. She was known for her surgically precise tactics and her utter lack of sentimentality. She didn't handle breakups. She orchestrated corporate-level dissolutions of marriage. Spread across the polished mahogany table were financial statements, reports from the forensic accounting team, and preliminary legal filings. Catherine was not a grieving wife. She was the CEO of her own liberation. "The accountants found it just as you suspected," Evelyn said, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on a highlighted column of figures. "A shell corporation, Sterling Horizons LLC, registered in Delaware. He's been siphoning funds from the main company into it for the last 18 months, ostensibly for scouting new properties. But the outflow doesn't match the assets acquired. This is where he's been hiding money." Catherine nodded, unsurprised. "That's the fund for his new life, the one he was planning without me. It's now Exhibit A in our motion to freeze his personal assets," Evelyn stated, a grimly satisfied smile on her face. "He'll wake up this morning to find his personal accounts locked and a court order barring him from making any unusual transactions with corporate funds. He's been neutered." This was the machinery Catherine had set in motion weeks ago. The moment she confirmed Richard's affair, she hadn't just called Dominic Thorne. She had retained Evelyn Reed. While Richard was buying Tiffany jewelry, Catherine was paying the retainers for a team of the city's best financial investigators. She had played the part of the preoccupied pregnant wife flawlessly, all while methodically building the case that would dismantle his life. "And Mr. Thorne's involvement?" Evelyn asked, peering over her glasses. "He's the seed investor in my new company," Catherine explained calmly. "Sterling Thorne Art Advisory. The initial capital transfer was made yesterday afternoon to our new corporate account." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, impressed. "You secured your funding before you declared war. Brilliant. Richard will try to paint this as an affair that you're in a relationship with Thorne. He'll use it to try and void the prenuptial agreement." "Let him try," Catherine said, a flicker of steel in her eyes. "Our contract is ironclad. Dominic is a limited partner and a mentor. Our relationship is purely professional. He will testify to that under oath, and his reputation for integrity is significantly more robust than my husband's. Besides, Richard's serial infidelity and fraudulent conveyance of marital assets will render his arguments moot." She was speaking a new language, now the language of power law and finance. She had learned it quickly. The true genius of her plan was not just in leaving Richard, but in how she was leaving him. She wasn't taking half of his assets to go live quietly somewhere. She was using her legal claim to that capital as the foundation for her own empire right in his backyard. She was becoming his competitor. Later that afternoon, Catherine stood in an empty, sun-drenched loft space in Chelsea, the future headquarters of her firm. The space was raw with exposed brick walls and vast industrial windows overlooking the Hudson River. Dominic Thorne stood beside her, his hands in his pockets, surveying the raw potential of the room. "It's a good space," he said. "Good light. Artists would approve." "That's the idea," Catherine replied, a genuine smile gracing her lips. "This won't be a stuffy uptown gallery. It's for a new world, a new kind of collector." "You're not just building a business, are you?" Dominic observed, his gaze perceptive. Catherine watched the dust motes dance in the shafts of sunlight. "For years my identity was Richard Sterling's wife. I was an accessory he acquired to complete a picture. When I found out about the affair, I realized that the picture was a lie, and the frame was a cage. I'm not just breaking the frame, Dominic. I'm painting a whole new masterpiece, and this time I'll be signing my own name to it." She placed a hand on her stomach, feeling the gentle flutter of her baby kicking. This loft wasn't just an office. It was a declaration of independence. It was the first brick in a new legacy, one built not on lies and acquisitions, but on her own talent, her own resilience, her own name. Richard had thought he was the architect of their lives, but he had made a fatal error. He had underestimated his partner. He never realized that while he was building a house of cards, she was quietly laying the foundation for a fortress. The fallout was not a distant storm. It was a Category 5 hurricane that made landfall directly over Richard Sterling's life. It began the next morning with a rap on his apartment door, so sharp it felt like a judgment. It was his driver holding a copy of the Wall Street Journal with the stiff formality of an undertaker. Richard took it, his hands trembling slightly. There on the front page of the business section was a photo of himself, a candid shot from a gala last year. Him smiling, holding a glass of champagne, the picture of arrogant success. The headline was a stiletto to the heart: Sterling's tarnished empire inside the scandal, threatening a real estate dynasty. He sank into a leather armchair, the paper crackling in the tomb-like silence of the apartment. The article, penned by a notoriously sharp investigative journalist, was a masterpiece of character assassination, all the more brutal for its factual precision. It detailed the shell corporation Sterling Horizons LLC, with a clarity that implied the journalist had been handed a roadmap. It spoke of a pattern of reckless spending on non-business-related assets and personnel, a thinly veiled reference to Tiffany. Most damningly, it quoted anonymous sources from within the lending community, expressing grave concerns about Sterling Properties' leadership stability and potential misappropriation of corporate funds for personal use. Evelyn Reed's fingerprints were all over it, an invisible hand guiding the narrative to its devastating conclusion. Before he could even finish the article, his phone, which had been ominously silent, erupted into a cacophony of incoming calls and notifications. It was his CFO, Robert, his voice a frantic squeak. "Richard, the market's open. We're in free fall. The stock is down 20% on the opening bell. What the hell is this article? What's Sterling Horizons?" Richard couldn't answer. He was watching the business news channel on the massive flat-screen TV across the room. The ticker for Sterling Properties SPX was a bleeding crimson arrow pointing straight down. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "SPX plummets amid CEO scandal divorce proceedings." His personal life, the one he had deemed separate and private, was now the lead story, dragging his life's work down into the abyss with it. His credit cards were the next to go. He tried to order an extravagant breakfast on an app, a defiant act of normalcy, only for the transaction to be declined. He tried another card, and then another. Payment failed. Payment failed. Payment failed. The message flashed on his phone, each notification a small electronic slap in the face. Evelyn Reed had been true to her word. The asset freeze was absolute. He was a billionaire on paper, but at that moment he couldn't afford a bagel. The days that followed blurred into a paranoid haze. He paced the vast expanses of the apartment, a caged animal rattling the bars of his gilded prison. The silence was his tormentor, broken only by the incessant, futile ringing of his calls to Catherine's phone. He left dozens of voicemails, his tone shifting wildly from rage-fueled threats to pathetic whimpering pleas. "Catherine, you can't do this. This is our life you're destroying," he'd yell. Hours later, he would call back, his voice cracking. "Katie, please. I'm sorry. I was a fool. We can fix this. Think of the baby." But his words vanished into a digital void. The only reply he ever received was the cold, formal text from Evelyn Reed, a digital wall he could not breach. He was completely, utterly excommunicated from the life he had built. A week after the story broke, he was summoned to the boardroom. As he walked through the gleaming lobby of Sterling Tower, the building that was a monument to his own ego, he felt like a ghost. Employees, people he had hired and mentored, scurried past their eyes, fixed on their phones or the floor, anywhere but on him. The walk of shame down the long marbled corridor to the boardroom was the longest of his life. The faces around the massive oak table were grim. These were men he had shared cigars and multi-million-dollar deals with. Now they looked at him with the cold appraisal of butchers examining a piece of meat that had spoiled. William Davies, the oldest board member, and a man Richard had once considered a father figure, cleared his throat. "Richard." William began, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. "We've all read the papers. More than that, our lenders have read them. Our shareholders have certainly read them. Our stock value has been halved. We are facing 6 shareholder lawsuits as of this morning." "This is a personal matter, Will." Richard pleaded, his voice hoarse. "My wife is... She's not well. She's being vindictive. This is a shakedown." It stopped being a personal matter when Sterling Horizons LLC appeared on our balance sheets. Richard, another director, interjected coldly. "It stopped being personal when you exposed this entire company to ridicule and financial ruin." William slid a single sheet of paper across the polished table. "Your employment contract, paragraph 12, section B, the morals clause. Conduct that brings the company or its leadership into public disrepute. I don't think anyone can argue that this threshold hasn't been met. The board has voted. We're exercising the clause. You're to take an immediate and indefinite leave of absence. You will surrender your company phone keys and access cards. Security will escort you out." The words hung in the air, clinical and final. He hadn't just been suspended. He had been surgically excised from his own company. Fired. The humiliation was a physical force, pressing down on him, stealing the air from his lungs. He was escorted from the room, and then from the building, a single box of his personal items in his arms. As he stood on the pavement outside his tower, the city lights seeming to mock him, he was no one. Miles away in a sun-drenched loft in Chelsea, a different world was being born. The raw space had been transformed. Clean white walls served as the perfect canvas, and the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings hung in the air. Catherine, looking more vibrant than ever, stood before a small, dedicated team. The Bresson collection is going to private auction next month." She announced, her voice resonating with confidence. "They have a minor Rothko that the market is undervaluing. Our analytics suggest it could be a keystone piece for a new collector. I want a full provenance report and a valuation analysis by Friday. Let's get ahead of this." Her team buzzed with energy, inspired by her vision and sharp intellect. Dominic Thorne stopped by that afternoon, not as a looming presence, but as a supportive mentor. He observed her in action, a small, approving smile on his face. "You've built a strong team," he commented, as they looked over the architectural plans for the main gallery space. "I choose people based on talent, not loyalty," she said, a subtle but clear jab at Richard's style of cronyism. "It tends to yield better results." She paused, placing a hand on the gentle curve of her belly. For a moment, she looked out the vast window at the city skyline. "For a while," she confessed softly, "I thought he had taken everything from me. My career, my confidence, my name. But he only took what I was willing to give. Now I'm building something that no one can ever take away." The final crushing blow for Richard came a month later. He was sitting in the dark, silent apartment, surrounded by the opulence that now felt like a taunt. A courier had delivered the last of his personal effects from the office, including a framed photo of him and Catherine at their wedding, a relic from a life that no longer existed. He picked it up, tracing the outline of her smiling face. He had possessed such beauty, such brilliance, and had treated it with the carelessness of a child with a priceless toy. His phone, now a device he mostly used to scroll through news of his own demise, buzzed with a notification from a major art publication. He clicked it. The screen illuminated with a professionally shot photograph of Catherine. She was standing in her completed gallery, a stunning space of light and minimalist elegance. She was posed beside a magnificent, vibrant painting, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. She looked regal, powerful, and utterly serene. But it was the headline that made the world finally and completely collapse around him. The new Sterling Standard, Catherine Sterling and Dominic Thorne, launch Sterling Thorne Art Advisory, poised to reshape the market. He dropped the phone. Sterling Thorne. She hadn't just divorced him. She hadn't just taken his money. She had taken his very name and forged it into her new brand, forever linking his legacy to hers, with his rival's name appended as a mark of his defeat. He was no longer the sole proprietor of the Sterling name. He was the disgraced prefix to her glorious new chapter. He hadn't just been replaced. He had been rendered a footnote in the story of her spectacular rise. As he stared at her image on the screen, a queen in her new kingdom, Richard Sterling alone, in the silent, empty fortress of his wealth, finally understood the profound, absolute, and irrevocable nature of true bankruptcy. He had lost everything because he had never truly valued the one thing that mattered. In the end, this wasn't just a story of infidelity. It was a story about underestimation. Richard Sterling saw his wife as a beautiful passive part of his life's portfolio, failing to see the brilliant strategic mind he had tried so hard to sideline. He thought his power was absolute, but he learned that true strength isn't about control and dominance. It's about resilience, intelligence, and the courage to rebuild. Catherine didn't just leave a cheating husband. She orchestrated a coup reclaiming her identity and building an empire from the ashes of his betrayal. She proved that the most powerful move is often the one your opponent never sees you coming. What did you think of Catherine's ultimate revenge? Was it a masterclass in strategy or a step too far? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were captivated by this story of intrigue and empowerment, please hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a good drama, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales of intricate lives and shocking twists. Your support helps us bring these stories to life. Click the notification bell so you never miss an update,